At 7:34 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron pushed the throttle of his TBD Devastator on the deck of the USS Hornet. The engine roared, and in seconds he was airborne, leading 15 torpedo planes toward almost certain death. Waldron was 42, a veteran with over 3,000 flight hours, and knew exactly what lay ahead. The night before, he had written his wife a letter. "If we don't make it," he penned, "you will know that we all did our best to win." The Devastators were notoriously slow, incapable of outrunning enemy fighters, and to launch their torpedoes, pilots had to fly straight and low, making them easy targets. To compound the danger, the Mark 13 torpedoes they carried were notoriously unreliable. Waldron led his men anyway, knowing 4 Japanese carriers were preparing to strike the U.S. base at Midway. The war stakes were immense, following Japan's devastating attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which left the U.S. Navy crippled. In the subsequent 6 months, Japan had conquered a massive territory, seizing Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's strategy was to deliver a knockout blow by destroying the remaining U.S. carrier fleet at Midway Atoll, a key air base 1,200 miles from Hawaii. The Japanese force was the largest ever assembled in the Pacific, featuring 4 frontline carriers, Kagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, crewed by the world's most seasoned pilots flying superior Zero fighters. Yet, the Americans held a decisive secret advantage. They had broken the Japanese naval code, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, in a hidden ambush northeast of Midway. The U.S. Navy's primary torpedo plane, the Douglas TBD Devastator, which Waldron and his men flew, was a death trap by 1942 standards. Though a technological marvel when introduced in 1937, it was now slow, poorly armored, and carried only light machine guns against the Zero's 20mm cannons. Its mandatory low, slow attack profile, flying straight at 115 miles per hour just 100 feet above the water, was suicidal, even if its faulty Mark 13 torpedoes had been reliable. Waldron had been realistic about their chances, drilling his men relentlessly and telling them that if only one plane was left, it must complete the mission. When the Japanese launched their first wave of 108 planes against Midway at 4:30 a.m., Waldron's fate, and that of the Pacific, began to unfold. The Japanese air attack leader reported back to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, "Second attack necessary." Nagumo, seeing no American ships, ordered his reserve planes, armed with anti-ship torpedoes, to be rearmed with land bombs for a second strike on Midway, creating dangerous chaos on his decks. At 7:40 a.m., a scout plane from the cruiser Tone sighted 10 enemy ships. 20 agonizing minutes later, the confirmation arrived, appears to include a carrier. Nagumo now faced the dilemma of his career: launch a weak, uncoordinated attack immediately or wait 45 minutes to rearm fully, leaving his exposed decks vulnerable to the American bombers. He chose to wait, adhering to doctrine, providing the Americans the vital time they needed, as Waldron broke formation with the Hornets air group and decisively steered his 15 unescorted Devastators north. At 9:18 a.m., Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 spotted the smoke of the Japanese fleet, 4 carriers and dozens of escort ships, and the swarm of defending Zero fighters. Waldron did not hesitate, pushing his control stick forward and plunging the squadron to sea level. 30 Zeros immediately descended on the 15 slow-moving Devastators, targeting the low-flying, straight-line attackers in what the Japanese pilots later described as a turkey shoot. Anti-aircraft fire from the ships joined the massacre. Waldron's plane was hit, burst into flames, and crashed into the sea. One after another, the Devastators were shot out of the sky. Ensign George Gay, the last pilot, released his torpedo at the Soryu, a miss, and was instantly intercepted by 5 Zeros. His gunner was killed, and his plane was riddled before he crashed into the water. Gay managed to escape the sinking plane, grabbed a flotation cushion, and hid beneath it, watching the battle unfold above him. All 15 Devastators were shot down, only Gay survived, and the squadron scored 0 hits. The Japanese pilots landed, laughing, and contemptuously called the American torpedo planes easy targets and sitting ducks. They were confident in their invincibility, unaware that the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 had dragged their Zeros down to low altitude, out of fuel and ammunition, buying the American dive bombers 30 precious minutes. The sacrificial pattern continued. At 9:40 a.m., 14 unescorted Devastators from Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 arrived, only to be immediately intercepted by the low-altitude Zeros. 9 were destroyed, and 0 torpedoes found their mark. At 10 a.m., 12 Devastators from Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 arrived, their small fighter escort quickly overwhelmed by the Zeros. Squadron Commander Lance Massey was shot down before releasing his torpedo, and 10 of the 12 Devastators were destroyed. In under an hour, 3 American torpedo squadrons were annihilated, with 35 planes lost and 47 men killed or captured, all for 0 hits. Yet, as the Japanese morale soared and Nagumo finally had his decks ready to launch a devastating counterattack at 10:20 a.m., the window of opportunity for the Americans was opening. While the torpedo squadrons were dying, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was lost, his fuel dwindling. Ignoring the naval protocol to return to the Enterprise, he used cold logic. Since Midway's patrol planes had reported no contact to the south, the Japanese must be to the north. At 10:05 a.m., McCluskey gambled and turned north. Just 10 minutes later, he saw a single destroyer, the Arashi, speeding across the water, rushing to rejoin the fleet after hunting an American submarine. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake. At 10:24 a.m., he spotted the Japanese carriers, decks fully loaded with fueled and armed aircraft, perfectly vulnerable. Simultaneously, 17 dive bombers from the Yorktown arrived from another direction. 2 massive waves of dive bombers arrived precisely when the Zeros were out of position, and McCluskey screamed the command, "Attack." At 10:24 a.m., the SBD screamed down in a 70-degree dive. Lieutenant Richard Best, realizing an error was concentrating the attack on the Kaga, broke formation and dove on the flagship Akagi with only 2 wingmen. The Japanese finally heard the terrifying cry of dive bombers. But it was far too late. Best's bomb hit the Akagi center, detonating the fuel and ordnance piled in the hangars. Simultaneously, the Kaga and the Sori were hammered by multiple direct hits. In a terrifying 5-minute blitz, 3 Japanese fleet carriers, the heart of the Kido Butai, became uncontrollable infernos. The Akagi was scuttled the next morning, followed by the Kaga and Sori later that day. The last carrier, the Hiryu, launched a retaliatory strike that damaged the Yorktown, but its position was discovered, and it was quickly bombed and sunk. In 24 hours, Japan lost 4 carriers, 3,000 men, and 248 planes, including hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. The U.S. lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 307 men, and 147 planes. Crucially, 35 of those lost were the Devastators that scored 0 hits. George Gay survived 30 hours in the water, horrified witness to the carnage, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, rescued by a PBY Catalina. He carried the indelible memory of the carriers burning in the terrible sacrifice that won the day. Waldron, Lindsay, and Massey all perished, their bodies never recovered. Few of the 47 men killed in the torpedo attacks received major public recognition, yet their deaths were essential. Without them, McCluskey would have been intercepted, the Japanese counterattack would have launched, and the American carriers would likely have been destroyed. Their sacrifice bought the vital minutes of chaos and distraction that turned the tide of the war. After Midway, Japan never regained the offensive, losing the strategic initiative and the irreplaceable aircrew that had given them global dominance. The U.S. Navy immediately retired the obsolete Devastators from frontline service, acknowledging them as death traps, but the faulty Mark 13 torpedoes would not be fixed until late 1943. Historians debate the true effectiveness of the torpedo squadron's sacrifice, some calling it tragic, others essential. The truth is that while the planes did not sink any ships, without them, the dive bombers would not have had their opportunity, the Zeros would have been at high altitude, and the carrier decks clear. Victory was won not by those who killed the most, but by those who sacrificed enough to give others a chance to win. Waldron, Lindsay, and Massey knew this when they flew. And in that moment, when the Japanese pilots laughed at the easy targets, they failed to realize those targets were buying the time necessary for the total destruction of their own powerful fleet.